No, they put some music on Michael Cornerstone of the keynote, and I have to facilitate this. So I want to make sure that it's done too. Yeah, so it's 11. Yeah, okay, that'll be good. And then we'll smash this way. Okay, and then that will be 20 minutes. Perfect. Okay. For discussion. For a lot? Yeah. Well, I don't know whether. I think you have plenty to say. Well, how about if I'll signal at 11. I'll do this for 11. And then when we have 15 minutes to go, I'll do 11. Okay.
I assume we'll be somewhat late to get started.
Good morning. Welcome to the Thought Leader Lecture, Learning from a Decade of Rigorous Research on Professional Development. Dr. Garet is Vice President and Institute Fellow at the American Institutes for Research. His areas of specialization include methodological issues in evaluating the impacts of educational interventions. His recent work is focused on teacher quality, professional development, and high school reform. He is currently serving as principal investigator for an experimental study of the impact of teacher and leader evaluation systems and co-principal investigator for an experimental study of the impact of teacher professional development in 4th grade mathematics conducted for the Institute of Education Sciences. He is also co-principal investigator for a large-scale evaluation of the intensive partnership sites for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Dr. Yoon is a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research, has considerable experience and expertise in designing, conceptualizing, and conducting large-scale program evaluations, especially as they relate to school reform initiatives and teacher professional development programs. Yoon is serving as project director for the What Works Clearinghouse project within AIR. He is currently working on an IES-funded study of the implementation of college and career-ready standards in schools. This year, he completed a National Science Foundation-funded Discovery Research K-12 grant to conduct a systematic review of research reports on mathematics teachers' professional development models, which he is going to share with you today. He was the principal investigator for another NSF-funded mathematics and science partnership grant work to study the impact of teacher professional development on the quality of classroom practice. As a word of note, we will have a Q&A session, so with about 10 minutes to go, depending upon the flow of the lectures, we'll signal you to ask questions, and then just please walk up to the mic and ask your question in the mic because the session is being recorded. Without further ado, I'd like you to welcome our speakers for today.
Good morning. I'm very, very glad to be here this morning. I want to talk about a personal journey that Kwang and I began actually more than 10 years ago, despite the decade in the title of our talk, when we worked together on an evaluation of the Eisenhower Professional Development Program. With a group of colleagues at AIR and at the time at the University of Wisconsin, we identified 6 features of what we thought were effective professional development. And the work we did was based on survey research methods. I think that I should have retired at that point because the six features spread a great deal in the literature on professional development. But I thought, well, we really should try to test whether professional development with these 6 features really has an impact on teacher and student outcomes as we expected. So the idea was, could we do a rigorous experiment that showed that PD with these features was effective? And so we set out to do this, and I really thought that the PD we tested would seem to be consistent with the 6 features, would prove effective, but it didn't. And more than a decade has gone by, and we and other colleagues around the country have been engaged in rigorous experimental studies of professional development. And I think we still don't know, based on the work so far, what features really make professional development effective. And so it's been a somewhat discouraging decade, perhaps, in that respect. But despite the discouragement, I remain personally very optimistic. And my task this morning, or the task I've set for myself, is to try to make the case for why I think continuing to test professional development using rigorous experimental methods is what we ought to be doing. And so that's what I want to talk with you about for the next few minutes. So I'm going to focus on rigorous studies whose purpose is to try to determine whether professional development has an impact on teacher outcomes, that is, teachers' knowledge and instructional practice in the classroom, and on student achievement. And the idea is to compare outcomes for teachers who participate in professional development that we've designed in a way that we think is effective with the so-called counterfactual. What would have happened had they not participated in that professional development? So that's what we want to do, compare teachers who participated in professional development with what might have happened had they not. And methodologists will say that the best way to do this is to randomly assign some teachers to receive the professional development and others not, because then the two groups will be equivalent from the start. I have a little picture here. The idea is we start out by flipping a coin, and that produces some teachers who go to the treatment condition and some who go to the control. And their students go with them. So the idea is that the teachers will continue to teach whatever classes they would have taught anyway, but some have professional development that we've designed to test, and others continue with business as usual. Then, once we've randomly assigned, the idea is to measure the teachers and their students at baseline before the professional development, measure the teacher's knowledge, their instructional practice, the students' pre-achievement. Then, deliver the professional development to the treatment teachers, and the control teachers continue with business as usual. And then we measure outcomes. And this is ideal because if it turns out that outcomes are better in the treatment group than in the control, we can almost certainly conclude that whatever the difference is due to the professional development. Why? Because the treatment and control teachers were the same at the start. They were just randomly different. So it's a great design, but it's not guaranteed actually to produce valid conclusions. Some things can go wrong. The biggest thing that often happens is you lose teachers along the way. They were randomly assigned, but some drop out of the study. If too many do, the treatment and control group won't be comparable anymore, and what was a nice random experiment isn't by the time you're done. And that actually happens in a lot of randomized experiments, so it's important to avoid that. It's possible to do a good study without randomization. The key thing is the treatment and the control groups have to be equivalent at the start. People refer to quasi-experiments, which are like true experiments but without random assignment. And there, the idea is to match the teachers at the start. And this can be done well, but then it's really important to measure baseline characteristics so you can be sure the two groups are equal. And that's what often goes wrong in quasi-experiments. Either they're not equal at the start, or they're not measured at the start, so we don't know. So what have we learned from the decade of work on randomized experiments? Well, the first thing is the decade is really misleading because there was a great randomized experiment done in 1989. It was the first widely cited experiment in professional development I know of, the cognitively guided instruction experiment done by Carpenter and colleagues from the University of Wisconsin. And it was really an ideal experiment that followed the picture that I just showed pretty neatly. They didn't lose teachers. There was no attrition, really. And there were several that we've been working on with colleagues at AIR and elsewhere, one on reading and one on middle school math, that had published results in 2008 and 2010 and 11. And I want to call your attention to one by Bob Pianta and colleagues that just came out a few years ago on My Teaching Partner. Are you all aware of the My Teaching Partner experiment? Well, it's published in Science magazine, an excellent experiment in which teachers were randomly assigned, and a big positive effect of the professional development was found the year after the teachers participated. There's several studies going on right now that will have results published over the next year. So this is an exciting time for randomized studies of professional development. So what do we know? Well, 7 reviews have been published of rigorous studies of professional development, at least 7. These are the 7 that I know of. And some have focused only on randomized studies. Some include quasi-experiments as well. And one very famous one is by my colleague Kwang in 2007. The reviews differ a lot in what they conclude, and that's largely because they differ in terms of the standards they held the studies to that they included in the reviews. How pure did the studies have to be? I encourage you to look at these reviews, and especially Mary Kennedy has a review that is just due to come out in the Review of Educational Research, and it's very interesting and should appear, I hope, in the next few months. So now, what do we know? Well, the first is that despite the widespread calls for doing studies of this kind, remarkably few have been done. I believe there are only about 10 true randomized experiments looking at the impact of professional development in mathematics in the United States. These are large-scale studies that are published or widely available. And of those, 3 or 4 are still underway, so we don't have the results. So this is a small database, and that's one of the things I want to impress upon you. We just don't have very many studies, and it's quite remarkable after the enormous call by the Institute of Education Sciences and others for such studies. There are more quasi-experiments than randomized studies, but many of these suffer from the problem that the teachers weren't equivalent at baseline, or we don't know whether they were because that wasn't measured. And so it's harder to know what to conclude from the quasi-experiments. I don't want to leave the impression that quasi-experiments are necessarily weak. They're not. It's just one has to have the baseline data to know whether the study is rigorous. Then a compounding problem is that very rarely has the same professional development been tested twice. And one study could always come out in some odd way due to quirks in the study. There are only 2 really that I know of that have been tested twice: cognitively guided instruction and My Teaching Partner, the Pianta intervention I mentioned a bit ago. In terms of the content, most studies of the professional development in math that we've reviewed have found an impact on teacher outcomes, that is, teachers' knowledge and teachers' instructional practice. So professional development appears to be able to affect what teachers do in the classroom and how they think about their work. But fewer have shown an impact on student achievement, and that is the mystery. Why is it possible to change teaching to some degree, but student achievement is harder to move? Another thing about the studies that have been done, most have examined the short-term impacts of the professional development, looking at perhaps a year of professional development and outcomes that year and in 1 year beyond that. There are very few studies that look longer. So if we believe that professional development has its effect over the long run, then the studies that have been done so far would miss that. Many of the studies that have been done are what I would call small-scale efficacy trials. that are testing professional development delivered by the developer of the professional development in a single location or on a small scale, which is very interesting to begin to do the R&D necessary to develop a professional development model, but it doesn't tell us what works at scale. So there have been many fewer that work at scale, and the ones that have been tested at scale tend to have weaker effects than the small scale studies. Another issue, and as Kwang is going to describe in some detail shortly, professional development interventions differ a lot in what they are, what the content is they're trying to teach teachers to engage in the classroom, how they do it. Is it online? Is it face-to-face? Is it a lecture like this? Is it a group working together? What is it? Is it coaching? Is it a professional learning community? And because of that, it's difficult to synthesize across the studies. And it's even more difficult because studies often don't describe what the professional development really was. And associated with that, the available studies have given too little attention to understanding why the professional development is supposed to work and measuring the path along the way. And so if teachers are supposed to improve their knowledge and that's supposed to improve students' achievement, does the study provide evidence that knowledge improved? And does it show that the knowledge that was measured is correlated with students' achievement, which is what you would expect if the model is working as it was planned? But often studies haven't done that. So I've been painting a picture of studies. I don't know, it's a glass half full or a glass half empty. There are some studies, not as many as we might hope, and the studies are not as rigorous or as perfect as we might hope for. So where do we go from here? So as I've said, there are too few studies, and because of that, it's really hard to draw conclusions about what we know. And I think that's one of the most important conclusions from the work, is we should be questioning about professional development. Not assume we know what works, but say we really have to figure out what works. That's what we're about. And to do this, I think we need to conduct many more rigorous studies, lots of studies. We're not anything like the situation in medicine where there are vast numbers of studies, just 10 that I could find in professional development and math, which we consider to be a crucially important discipline. So we need to conduct more rigorous studies, and we need to implement professional development in a way that maximizes what we can learn about whether it works and why it works. So I have 3 concrete recommendations. The first is that when states and districts or schools roll out professional development programs, they should roll them out to some schools or teachers, but not others, using a lottery. Whenever something new, if there's a new coaching program, don't give it to all the teachers at once. Randomly assign through lottery, some to get the coaching and some not, and then follow what happens. People argue, well, it's unfair, but I don't know whether it's really unfair, because who knows if the coaching is really working. And until we find out whether it's working or for whom it's working, maybe it's just wasting resources, or maybe it really is effective and we should spread this widely, but we just won't know unless we roll it out to some, but not to others. I think to make this recommendation a reality, districts need to be provided additional resources to be able to do it. So there should be in all large school districts, I think, a random assignment officer. I mean, maybe that's not the right title, but someone who really says, okay, we are going to try this intensive professional development activity, and let's think seriously about how we're going to roll it out so we can learn. And then work with the with the facilitators and others in the district to make this happen. This may seem like a pipe dream, but it isn't. There's an excellent book by Manzi called Uncontrolled that was published in the last couple of years that talks about this kind of practice in business and industry. And it turns out that a lot of businesses are doing random assignment when they work out their approach to retail sales, to marketing. Google, if you use Google, you don't see it, you don't know it's happening, but they are constantly randomizing what happens on the screen. So you might be in the treatment group or you might be in the control, you don't know. But the question is, what is more efficient in terms of processing the information? We at AIR just made a job offer to an excellent education researcher to help us do randomized experiments. But he didn't come, he went to Google to do randomized experiments there. I'm hoping he returns to education one day. But also, as you may know, the Obama campaign did this in the last election as well. In terms of their calls to prospective voters, they randomly assigned different voters to different scripts and then followed what happened to optimize the appropriate way to contact voters. So this is quite doable, and in fact, it's more doable, I think, by real organizations, school districts, states, charter school organizations, and so forth, than it is by researchers, because those organizations are in the position to actually deliver the professional development and to ensure that the random assignment occurs as planned and is followed through. The third part of my recommendation is when a PD initiative is launched, to spell out what's supposed to happen. Don't just say, okay, the teachers are supposed to get coaching and then all the students' achievement will be higher. But what is the chain that leads from the coaching to the student achievement? What should happen during the coaching? What will we see in the teachers' classrooms that's different? What are the early signs? What are the later signs? So those things can be measured, and districts should be measuring these things. And then we can see, is the chain unfolding as it's planned? And that just rarely happens. Even with studies of the kind I've been involved with, if I were going to criticize my own studies, it's because we haven't spelled out the chain carefully enough. It's really crucial, I think. So those are my three recommendations. I want to turn things to Kwang at this point, who's going to talk about the crucial role of describing the professional development and spelling it out. But the last thing I want to say is that I don't know whether I'll be retired in 10 years, but if we gather again in 10 years and have another session like this one, I hope there's a mountain of evidence we can talk about, and so then we'll actually be able to pull it together and figure out what features of professional development really work. And so with that, I'll turn things to Kwang.
Thank you, Mike. Now I'm going to switch gear. Mike's presentation was focused on rigorous research on PD. I may as well focus on rigorous description of PD. As Mike said, sometimes there was not enough information about key PD features that we care about. And that's what we wanted to know about. The point of departure of my presentation is American Educational Research Association's recent publication of their guideline on what to report and how to report educational research. So as you can see, they recommend that when an intervention or treatment is implemented, the intervention should be described in sufficient detail so that its key features can be identified and used to account for results and be compared with related interventions. This is the key point that I'm trying to stress. As part of our National Science Foundation funded study, we examined the ways that in which researchers described PD interventions by reviewing more than a sample of more than 170 research papers. These papers include not only the randomized controlled trials, a very, very rigorous scientific study, evaluative study, but also some descriptive studies that document what happened, what is the design, and how it was implemented. And most of the papers presented research on PD interventions that were developed and facilitated by university professors, which skewing our sample to represent what PD looks like when it is connected to universities rather than the general professional development interventions offered to teachers by many schools and districts. As Mike mentioned, districts are well positioned to conduct research on professional development and generate reports on them, but they haven't taken advantage of such opportunities, possibly due to lack of some inherent incentives, I guess. So our research focused on mathematics PD, and we addressed the following three questions. Number one, what is included and what is not included in descriptions of PD interventions presented in research reports? Two, how are the PD interventions characterized in these reports? Three, what do we know about design mathematics PD being studied by researchers? We used an analytic framework which is organized around 6 elements of PD. First 3 is about the substance of PD: theory, goals, and content. The other 3 the elements are about PD form, using Mary Kennedy's distinction between PD substance and PD form. 3 forms include context, organization, and activities. I am going to share key findings and by highlighting only a few of them. First, in terms of theories. Of the total of 173 studies that we reviewed, only 31 reported on teacher learning theories, 21 reported on student learning theories. The great majority of these studies came from the constructivist perspective. Please note that only a minority of studies reported on theories that underlie the design of their PD interventions. Next, on goals. Many papers reported on their PD goals that they try to achieve to increase the teacher's knowledge and skills. Of 157 out of 173. Of the 157 papers that reported, there are 3 most often reported goals as primary: pedagogical content knowledge, subject matter knowledge, in this case math content knowledge, and student learning. Less frequently reported goals include curriculum materials, technology, and classroom assessment. And there are other goals as well, but they are very minor. Now, in terms of content, it is very surprising that even though they are supposed to describe PD content, what they try to increase the knowledge of teachers, only less than a half of papers really specify the specific content trends, like in terms of number sense, or algebra, or geometry. The most often often reported content trend was numbers and number systems and operation, followed by algebra and geometry. In terms of context, the degree to which contextual information was reported varied widely, from 90%, 94% for number of participating teachers to only 13% for the curriculum that was used as part of their PD intervention. We thought curriculum being used as part of their PDs is very crucial, but not many studies reported on that. And then very few research papers reported on the PD that took place concurrently with the PD intervention under study, what we call ambient PD. And also very few studies reported on the PD that had taken place prior to the PD intervention, what we call precursor PD. And most of the research papers describe activities or the artifacts they have used. And various formats of PD have been reported by researchers. They range from very popular workshops, summer institutes, and college courses, but less frequently used format included something like lesson study, professional learning community, and coaching. And surprisingly, less than a half of papers reported on such a key design feature as contact hours, which is as a measure of dosage of intervention. And activities and, I think I mixed up. Activities and artifacts used. Most popular activities included discussion, development of some materials such as lesson studies, collaboration, and reflection. And less frequently reported activities included journaling, receiving feedback, and assessment work. And about over half of the studies reported on the artifacts they used. So our conclusion is that there exists large variation in how PD is described in research reports, and there's a substantial gap in the fundamental, gap in the information in terms of fundamental aspects of PD. For example, the number of hours that were devoted to the professional development, or the specific content strands of the PD focus. Such lack of information makes it very difficult for us to build knowledge, characterize models of PD interventions, determine what makes PD effective, and compare results across studies. We need to ensure that studies are well designed and implemented, but we also need to make sure that PD that was tested is described in sufficient detail to draw conclusions. So implications may include that the establishment of some reporting standards in PD research can improve the quality of work in the field of PD research. And we hope that many practitioners use our conceptual framework for systematic descriptions of PD as a tool for future design and the conduct of PD in your setting. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If you have any questions for the panelists, please step up to the mic. If we need to form a row, we'll form a row.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm Linda Peterson. I work with Fairfax County Public Schools, and I'm in charge of PD for about 38,000 students every year. I want to thank you both. I've used your research in developing the PD that we're using with our teachers, specifically using Desimoni's model, the core conceptual model of PD. What I'm finding as a practitioner is I can't actually jump to that measurement of student learning quantitatively. My job is much more organic in helping teachers to determine what are those factors, I'm talking about those core features, those 5 core features in Desimoni's model, that are most impactful for them. So we're conducting a research. I'm in my second year in my school district. I've been given great support from my school district. They do like to implement the research. But what I'm finding is that even when those core features are implemented, there are other factors, could be a teacher's life circumstances, marriage, baby, parents needing help, but also school factors, such as the teacher in the PD. You talked about attrition, but if a teacher is given additional duties, that can also really impact the degree to which they're able to implement whatever the PD intervention is. So what I would like is also for us to consider in that core conceptual framework some way to capture the impact of some of these other factors, these other external factors that may actually impact the implementation of the PD but aren't part of that PD itself, because life doesn't occur in that vacuum. So anyway, thank you very much.
I think you make a number of very good points. One is that it's the important role of context in understanding the effects of professional development, and the features, active learning and coherence and so forth, don't stand on their own. It depends on the context in which the professional development is implemented, and I don't think we yet know what contextual features really matter. So that's one of the things that needs to be studied. What do we need to hold fixed? And if teachers are moving from one subject assignment to another, from grade 2 to grade 4, if the curriculum is changing, if other things are changing, then maybe it's no wonder that the PD doesn't work. So part of the design of the PD, it seems to me, is to design the conditions that are required in order to make it work. Another question I have, I guess, for you is whether you have been able to try the idea of rolling out the professional development to some teachers and not others, so that you can compare the results. Yes.
Yes, in a way. As I said, we're more at the qualitative state, just looking at how those core features interact. Certainly measuring changes in teachers' knowledge and beliefs and attitudes, observing their classroom practice, classroom observations, and also student learning. Could you restate your question? I lost my place.
I wondered if you had tried out rolling out the professional development
Yes.
to some teachers but not others, so that you could compare.
Absolutely. So what my colleague and I in the high school have been doing is we have what we call a cohort model. And so some of the teachers, and they are volunteers, it's not a random assignment, because as I see, we're at a more preliminary stage. And what we're doing is we're really focusing very intently on the professional development of that cohort. For example, this year I have 15 middle school science teachers working on collaborative discourse in the classroom and the use of discourse scaffolds. But the PD is designed using Desimoni's core conceptual framework. So we're doing two things concurrently. So we're looking at those teachers and we're looking at their changes in their students' ability to engage in higher level conversations, right? We're really trying to develop students' critical thinking. And we're looking at other teachers also. So we're looking at that comparison between that volunteer group and the other teachers that aren't. So yes.
Excellent.
Good morning. We've been grappling with this idea of trying to equate the outcomes of professional learning with student learning outcomes. And we've come to the conclusion that it's probably impossible, and that these attempts to do so are probably not leading us anywhere quickly. I'm wondering whether, in your view, we're actually asking the wrong question in terms of the research. Should we be asking, what are the things we can put in place in terms of school improvement, and start to look at those factors that we are aiming at that are more generalized in terms of school improvement, rather than trying to test the impact of PD on learning outcomes for students. Because all of those, I like that term you used, was it ambient PD? And what Linda's referring to of these other factors that are involved that we have no control over, the actual measurement of the correlative link between these two things seems impossible to me. So in fact, are we asking the wrong question?
Well, another excellent question. I think the part of the question is, what is the professional development about? And is it part of a vision of teaching and learning? And so it's not just professional development in a way, but it's professional development along with expectations for students and materials and whatever else is part of the reform effort. But I guess I'm less pessimistic than you are, although perhaps I should be more pessimistic given the results we've gotten so far. But Bob Pianta's study of my teaching partner that I mentioned earlier was purely a professional development intervention, and it was based on providing feedback to teachers on their classroom instruction. The teachers were videoed every couple of weeks. They submitted the video, and they got the video coded using the class scoring system, which was a lot about their support for students and classroom organization. And teaching practice improved, and student achievement seemed to improve as well. And so that's an indication that professional learning can happen. I think I wouldn't consider professional development on its own to be the only strategy. I think it needs to be integrated with other strategies. So I'm not sure I've really addressed your question, but I see it as less hopeless, I guess, than your question implies.
I think our presentation was very much focused on increasing the capacity of teachers as individuals. However, we also try to address this issue of increase the capacity at the organizational level, school level and district level. So it is not only as teachers as individuals, but also there are organizational goals, larger goals that, for example, the district vision to develop a professional learning community, and also increased its capacity to solve some district-wide problems. And that is going to be increasingly more of strategy that many districts are engaged in. Recently we have found some evidence of effects of professional learning community, because the professional development targeted on individual teachers and and their leaders have direct impact, indirect impact on other members of schools. So it is called spillover impact or effects. Maybe through some sort of learning community. It's not just my own learning, but also you share your learning with other teachers in your building or district. And so I guess we are hopeful that we see more and more effects in terms of more organizational learning as well.
I was thinking that one important aspect of the vision I'm trying to argue for is to think of the process as one of continuous improvement, that you try something, get feedback on it, tune it up, and then work on it again. And that has rarely happened, I think, to the degree it should in professional development. People used to complain about one-shot professional development for teachers. I think we have one-shot studies. Some intervention is studied, it doesn't work, and that's the end, and then we're on to something else, rather than a cycle. Let's try it, see whether the next steps occur that are supposed to follow, and then strengthen it, and then try it, strengthen it and try it. That means trying it again. I go back to on a few teachers, not the whole district, and then tune it up in the process of rolling it out.
I think so one of our findings include that very few studies built on some existing models or intervention. There's only few exceptions. You provide some exception of CGI, cognitively guided instruction, and my teaching partner. But we found CGI and the SimCalc in mathematics were the only two interventions that were replicated or studied over and over again. I mean, I'm not talking about like 10 times, but like more than once. So that shows the state of the art.
Do we have any additional questions for our panel?
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
To help me think a little bit more about taking the points you ended with our comment from our colleague in Fairfax County. To what extent do you find rigorous, truly rigorous by design research, evaluations of effectiveness, including also very rigorous, thorough examinations of the implementation of the PD, a la implementation science, so that when you look at the results, you have in there already the description of how it rolled out, why it rolled out that way, where it rolled out better than others, and so the results are in context. To what extent is that happening in practice at the highest levels now or not? Thank you.
Another very good question. I think it isn't. As Kwang described, many studies actually don't describe most of those things, and that so that we need a much, much bigger emphasis on measuring implementation, describing the professional development as it was delivered, what were its features and qualities, and then measuring what happens in the classroom following the PD. And neither of those happens to the extent that it should. And so it's no wonder, I think, that we haven't learned as much as we should. And then where is the professional development being rolled out? I mean, what's the nature of the schools? What's the curriculum? All of these contextual factors. So I think the existing research is poor on those fronts. Yes?
So what's needed? Is it just more people doing this work, more stuff? So if a district wants to do it, if a state wants to do it, if a researcher wants to do it, you just need a bigger team?
That's, yes, boy, this is a
Right?
hard question. I think it's not just a bigger team. Actually, I think we don't have the right infrastructure to do this work. That I think Fairfax County is in a lucky position in a way, that I think it has resources that many districts don't. But I don't think we have the right kinds of organizations. We need true R&D organizations that are working collaboratively with districts to invent, roll out, monitor, and test the PD. That I don't think it's entirely money. But universities aren't quite in the right position because it's individual faculty doing research. Organizations like mine, we've principally been doing external evaluations of pre-existing things, like we did an evaluation of letters and of America's Choice Math and so forth, but we weren't partners with them in repeated cycles. I think we need to develop a new form of organization that marries the development and the monitoring and evaluation and the work with districts to roll it out. It might be something like the Consortium on Chicago School Research, but they aren't in the position or haven't been in developing interventions. They've been mostly monitoring. So I think you ask, I fear that in 10 years, if we have this session again, it won't be better because we don't have the right organizations to do the work. It's sort of a chicken and egg question, though, because how do you get the right organizations in place? Maybe it's the RELs, maybe it's the, I'm not sure. I don't know. What do you think?
We have time for one more question. Would anybody like to ask a question of our panel, please?
Was related to that. I was going to ask if there was work going on in organizations like the Regional Education Laboratories working with practitioners in districts or schools at the start. So in the design that would address both needs, the characteristics, the contextual characteristics. When you mentioned in your slide about needing standardized reporting so that the information, couldn't we begin with the design? And just wondered if work is going on in that way, and what can we look to some of that? We've heard some, so that we don't have to wait another decade. We can begin to work with this work now. And thank you.
There are some examples I know of. We're engaged in a regional, in a network of schools in New England working on math professional development that's in the very early stages, and I think is a little bit like what you're talking about. Kwang, do you know examples of this kind of work? We're partnering with developers or trying to begin doing that. Is anyone familiar with Mathalicious? It's a professional development that we've been talking with. I think this is hard work, and we need to build partnerships. That's a crucial part of it. I should have had that as the fourth part of a fourth point on my list. Well, those were excellent hard questions.
Well, we're about out of time. Could we have another round of applause for Dr. Garet and for Dr. Yoon, please? Thank you, gentlemen.